"Get out of this office right now, or I'll shoot." That's what the so-called HOA cop screamed when my wife refused to open the door. For 4 months, they had been fabricating rules, sending bogus seizure notices, and even showing up in fake police uniforms, trying to force us out of the very office we legally rented. But that day, my wife calmly locked the door, took a sip of her tea, and pressed a single button on her phone. 12 minutes later, a black SUV pulled up. 3 people stepped out, and let's just say when the real guns showed up, only one person ended up in handcuffs, and it wasn't my wife. Can you guess who she is? It all began on a Tuesday morning in March, when I pulled into our small office parking lot and found an official-looking envelope wedged under the windshield wiper of my Honda Civic. The letterhead, in bold, intimidating letters, read, "Maplewood Heights, Homeowners Association," seemingly designed to make you feel guilty before you even opened the damn thing. I had been renting this tiny 2,000-square-foot office space, formerly a converted garage, behind the Hendersons' house for almost 6 months, running my IT consulting business without a single complaint from anyone. The space was perfect for me, quiet enough to focus on code, close enough to home, that I could bike there in good weather, and cheap enough that I didn't have to stress about overhead eating into my already modest freelance income. The letter signed by someone named Eleanor Vance with the title HOA President, stamped in gold foil, informed me that my commercial activities violated Section 12.7b of the Community Guidelines, which prohibited unauthorized business operations within residential zones. The problem was I'd checked those guidelines before signing the lease 6 months ago, and Section 12.7b said absolutely nothing about home offices or small businesses. In fact, the actual Section 12.7b was about pool maintenance schedules. I know because I'm the kind of person who reads the fine print, a habit I picked up after watching my father get scammed out of his life savings by a financial advisor who buried the real terms in subsection 47 of a 200-page investment contract. When I got home that evening, I spread the HOA letter across our kitchen table next to a printed copy of the actual community guidelines I'd downloaded from the county website. My wife Elara looked up from her laptop, where she was working on what she always described as cybersecurity consulting for boring corporate clients. Though I'd noticed she never seemed particularly eager to discuss the details of her work, she had this way of deflecting conversations about her job with a smile and a subject change that I'd grown accustomed to over our 3 years of marriage. "What's got you looking like someone just told you pineapple belongs on pizza?" she asked, closing her laptop with a soft click. I handed her the letter and watched her dark eyes scan the document with an intensity that seemed disproportionate to what should have been a simple HOA dispute. She read it twice, then set it down and picked up the printed guidelines, her finger tracing along the relevant sections. "This doesn't match," she said simply, but there was something in her voice, a slight edge that I'd never heard before. "Section 12.7b is about pool maintenance. This letter is referencing rules that don't exist." She looked at me directly, and for just a moment I saw something flicker across her face that reminded me of the expression she got when she was debugging particularly complex security vulnerabilities at work. "Mark, this isn't just a mistake. Someone is deliberately misrepresenting the HOA rules." The next morning, I called the number listed on the letterhead and found myself speaking to Eleanor Vance herself. Her voice had that particular quality of authority that some people develop when they've spent too much time in small positions of power, like a middle school principal or a DMV supervisor. "Mr. Davies," she said, drawing out my name like it tasted unpleasant. "I'm sure you understand that homeowners associations exist to maintain property values and community standards. Your little computer business may seem harmless to you, but it sets a precedent that could lead to all sorts of commercial activities, disrupting our peaceful residential environment. And I explained that I'd reviewed the actual HOA guidelines and that my office space didn't violate any existing rules, but Eleanor cut me off with a laugh that sounded like ice cubes clinking in an empty glass. "Mr. Davies, I've been managing this community for 7 years. I think I know our rules better than someone who's been here less than a year." She paused, and I could hear papers rustling in the background. "However, I'm willing to work with you. There's a special inspection fee of $2,000 that covers the administrative costs of reviewing non-standard residential use cases. Once that's processed, we can discuss a commercial permit that would allow you to continue operating." The thing is, there was no mention of any special inspection fee anywhere in the HOA documentation. I'd been through every page, every subsection, every appendix. This woman was making up fees out of thin air. When I told her so, her voice dropped to a temperature that could have preserved vaccines. "Mr. Davies, I suggest you carefully consider your next move. The HOA has significant authority to protect our community's interests, and we will use that authority if necessary. You have 1 week to comply with our requirements or face further action." That evening, as Alara and I sat on our small back porch, sharing a bottle of wine and watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, I recounted my conversation with Eleanor. Alara listened without interrupting, occasionally sipping her wine, but I noticed she was gripping the glass more tightly than usual. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the neighbor's garden, where Mrs. Chen was watering her tomato plants. "Mark," she said finally, "do you trust me?" It was an odd question, but I nodded immediately. "Good," she said, "because I have a feeling this Eleanor person has no idea what she's dealing with." The following Tuesday, exactly 1 week after the first letter, another envelope appeared under my window. This time, it had a red, urgent stamp across the front. Inside was a notice of violation, complete with photos of my office space that someone had taken while trespassing on private property. The letter demanded I cease all business activities immediately and pay a $500 fine for continued non-compliance with community standards. At the bottom, in small print, was a line that made my blood run cold. Failure to comply within 48 hours will result in property seizure proceedings and potential legal action. Something about Blake immediately struck me as off, but I couldn't quite put my finger on what it was. Maybe it was the way his badge seemed to catch the light wrong, or how his shoes looked more like the kind you'd buy at Payless than the sturdy boots real cops wear, or the fact that his radio appeared to be a walkie-talkie from Radio Shack circa 2003. But I was too intimidated by the uniform and the official clipboard to voice my concerns, so I led him to the office space behind the Hendersons' house, all while texting Alara to let her know what was happening. Blake spent about 20 minutes inside the office, taking photos of everything from my computer setup to the small coffee maker I kept on the bookshelf, muttering things like unauthorized electrical usage and commercial equipment in residential zone, while scribbling notes that probably weren't even real words. He seemed particularly interested in a folder of client contracts I kept on my desk, photographing each page with the kind of theatrical intensity that made me wonder if he'd learned police procedure from watching CSI reruns. The whole time I noticed he kept adjusting his belt, like the equipment was too heavy or positioned wrong, and twice he nearly tripped over his own feet while trying to navigate around my desk chair. While Blake was busy playing detective with my filing cabinet, I spotted Alara walking casually past the office window, apparently heading to the mailbox, but taking an unusually long route that happened to give her a perfect view of our security officer in action. She was wearing sunglasses despite the overcast weather and carrying what looked like her regular purse, though I'd never noticed before how carefully she seemed to be observing everything around her. When Blake emerged from the office 15 minutes later, clipboard full of evidence, Alara was nowhere to be seen. But I had the strangest feeling she'd been watching the entire time. "Mr. Davies," Blake announced, straightening his uniform shirt in a way that made his fake badge catch the light again. "I'm documenting multiple violations of HOA commercial activity restrictions. You'll be receiving a formal notice within 24 hours, and I strongly advise you to comply with all directives to avoid escalation." He handed me a business card that looked like it had been printed at Kinko's Complete with slightly smudged text and a logo that was not any official law enforcement agency I'd ever seen. "Have a good day, sir," he added, then walked to a beat-up Honda Civic that definitely wasn't a police vehicle and drove away with all the authority of a pizza delivery driver running late for his next stop. That evening, Alara and I sat in our living room while she listened to my account of Blake's visit with the kind of focused attention that made me feel like I was being debriefed rather than just telling my wife about my day. She asked specific questions about his equipment, his vehicle, the exact wording he'd used, and whether I'd noticed anything unusual about his behavior. When I mentioned the Dollar General pen and the Radio Shack walkie-talkie, she smiled for the first time since this whole mess had started. But it wasn't the warm, amused smile I was used to seeing. This smile had an edge to it, like someone who just figured out the answer to a puzzle they'd been working on. "Mark," she said, setting down her teacup, with the kind of deliberate precision that suggested she was choosing her words very carefully. "I don't think Blake Peterson is a police officer." Before I could ask what she meant, she continued, "I did a little research this afternoon. Real HOA security officers have to be licensed through the state, and their vehicles have to be properly marked with company information and registration numbers. Blake's car had neither." She pulled out her phone and showed me a photo she'd somehow taken of Blake's license plate. "This vehicle is registered as a daily rental from Budget Car Rental. Real security officers don't drive rental cars to official inspections." The next morning, Eleanor's promised formal notice arrived, this time hand-delivered by Blake himself, who seemed considerably less confident than he had during his first visit. The notice was printed on letterhead that looked official until you noticed the typos and the fact that the HOA Security Division logo was clearly clipped from a generic shield with a house inside it. More importantly, the document claimed authority under Municipal Code 47C, which a quick Google search revealed didn't exist in our county, our state, or possibly anywhere in the United States. When I called Alara to tell her about the fake municipal code, she was quiet for a long moment before saying, "Marcus, I need you to trust me for just a little longer. I think I know what's going on here, but I need to confirm a few things before we take action." There was something in her voice, a certainty that hadn't been there before, like she'd moved from gathering information to planning a response. "Can you do that for me?" I told her I could, even though every practical bone in my body wanted to march over to Eleanor's house and demand answers. "Good," she said, and I could hear her moving around like she was gathering equipment or files, "because tomorrow we're going to find out exactly who Blake Peterson is." That night, as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling and wondering how a simple office rental had turned into whatever this was becoming, I heard Alara in the kitchen making a phone call in what I was now certain was Hebrew, her voice carrying the kind of professional authority I'd never heard her use before. I've always been the kind of person who believes that if you dig deep enough into any problem, you'll find a logical explanation that makes everything click into place like a well-designed piece of code. So while Ilara was off doing whatever mysterious research she'd hinted at, I decided to conduct my own investigation into Eleanor Vance and her increasingly bizarre HOA operation. What I found over the next 2 days made me realize that our little office dispute was just the tip of an iceberg that went much deeper and darker than I'd ever imagined. It started when I drove through Maplewood Heights with a different perspective, paying attention to properties that looked vacant or showed signs of recent turnover. In a community of about 200 homes, I counted at least 15 houses that appeared empty, which seemed unusually high for a neighborhood that was supposedly in high demand. When I checked the county property records online, a pattern emerged that made my stomach drop. Over the past 2 years, Eleanor Vance had been involved in the acquisition of 12 different properties through HOA enforcement actions, all following a remarkably similar pattern to what was happening to me. The process was like a well-oiled machine of bureaucratic intimidation. First, property owners would receive violation notices for infractions that either didn't exist in the actual HOA guidelines or were so vaguely worded that they could be interpreted to mean almost anything. When owners protested or refused to pay the associated fines, the violations would escalate to emergency compliance issues, requiring immediate action. Property owners would then face mounting fines, legal threats, and visits from security officers like Blake until they either paid enormous sums of money or abandoned their properties entirely. The abandoned properties would then be sold through HOA foreclosure proceedings to something called Maplewood Development LLC. Here's where it got interesting. Maplewood Development LLC was registered as a limited liability company with the state, but when I traced the business registration through the Secretary of State's website, the listed owner was E. Vance Management Services. A little more digging revealed that E. Vance Management Services was owned by someone named Eleanor A. Vance. Our HOA president wasn't just enforcing made-up rules for the good of the community. She was systematically forcing people out of their homes so she could buy their properties at foreclosure prices and flip them for massive profits. The financial scope of the operation was staggering. Based on the property values I could find online, Eleanor had acquired roughly $12 million worth of real estate over 2 years through this scheme, buying properties for pennies on the dollar through HOA foreclosures and then selling them at market rates. My little office space, according to recent commercial rental comparisons in the area, was probably worth about $50,000 if someone wanted to purchase the lease and conversion rights. Not exactly retirement money, but enough to make it worth the effort of running an elaborate intimidation campaign against one freelance IT consultant who just wanted a quiet place to work. While I was playing amateur detective with public records, Ilara had been conducting her own investigation using methods that seemed considerably more sophisticated than Google searches and county websites. When I came home Wednesday evening with a folder full of printouts and a head full of righteous indignation about Eleanor's scam, I found my wife sitting at our kitchen table with her laptop open and what looked like surveillance photos spread across the surface. The photos showed Blake at various locations around town, including what appeared to be him going into an apartment complex that wasn't a police station. "Find anything interesting?" Ilara asked, looking up from a photograph that showed Blake in civilian clothes pumping gas into the same Honda Civic he'd driven to our office inspection. Her tone was casual, but there was something in her eyes that reminded me of a chess player who'd been thinking several moves ahead while her opponent was still figuring out how the pieces moved. because I discovered some fascinating things about our friend Blake Peterson. She handed me a printout that looked like it had come from some kind of professional database. Real name, Blake Michael Peterson, age 34, resident of Pine Grove Apartments on the east side of town. Occupation part-time actor and full-time Uber driver. Previous experience in law enforcement, exactly 0. The database printout included Blake's employment history, which read like a catalogue of job-hopping desperation, pizza delivery driver, retail associate at 3 different stores, background extra in 2 locally filmed commercials, and, most recently, driver for various gig economy apps. No security training, no police academy, no certifications of any kind that would qualify him to conduct official inspections or carry anything resembling authority. According to the document, he'd been hired 3 weeks ago as an AHA independent contractor by something called Vance Consulting Services for a project described as Community Compliance Assistance. How exactly did you get access to this kind of background information? I asked, studying the printout, which included details that seemed far beyond what any normal citizen could dig up through standard channels. The document had a header that looked vaguely official, but didn't identify any specific agency or company. Elara smiled and closed her laptop with a soft click. Let's just say I have access to better research tools than most cybersecurity consultants, she said. The important thing is that we now know Blake is a paid actor and Eleanor is running a sophisticated real estate fraud operation that's been going on for years. That evening, as we sat on our back porch planning our next move, my phone buzzed with an email notification. The subject line read, "Final Notice Property Seizure Proceedings," and the sender was listed as HOA Legal Department. I opened it to find a message claiming that my continued non-compliance with community standards had triggered emergency enforcement procedures and that authorized personnel would be arriving the next morning to secure the premises pending resolution of outstanding violations. The email was signed by Eleanor Vance with a new title, Director of Community Enforcement. Elara read the email over my shoulder, and I felt her tense up beside me. "Marquis," she said, her voice carrying a tone I'd never heard before, something between concern and determination. "Tomorrow morning I need you to trust me completely. Can you do that?" I nodded even though I had no idea what she was planning. "Good," she said, already reaching for her phone. "Because it's time for Eleanor and Blake to learn that some people fight back when you try to steal from them." As she walked into the house, I heard her speaking in rapid Hebrew again, but this time her voice carried the unmistakable authority of someone giving orders rather than asking for help. Thursday morning arrived with the kind of grey, overcast sky that seemed perfectly suited for whatever confrontation Eleanor had planned for us. I was sitting in my office, pretending to work on client projects, while actually refreshing my email every 30 seconds and jumping at every sound outside when Blake's Honda Civic pulled up at exactly 9:00 a.m. This time, he wasn't alone. A woman emerged from the passenger seat, wearing what appeared to be a security uniform that looked even more questionable than Blake's policed in costume. She had the kind of nervous energy that suggested she was either very excited about her first day on the job or very worried about getting caught doing something she shouldn't be doing. Blake approached the office door with considerably more swagger than he'd shown during his previous visits, probably emboldened by having backup and what appeared to be an official-looking document folder tucked under his arm. "Mr. Davies," he called out, not bothering to knock. "This is your final opportunity to comply with HOA enforcement procedures. Open this door immediately, or we will be forced to use emergency protocols to secure the premises." His voice had taken on a theatrical quality that reminded me of community theater actors trying to project to the back row, and I noticed he kept glancing at his female partner like he was looking for approval of his performance. The woman whom Blake introduced as Officer Christine Miller from HOA Security Services seemed even less convincing than Blake himself. Her uniform was a size too large. Her badge was pinned on crooked, and she had the kind of deer-in-headlights expression that suggested she'd learned her lines about 5 minutes ago in the car. When she spoke, it was with the hesitant delivery of someone reading from a script they'd never seen before. "Sir, we have authorization to inspect these premises for code violations and remove any unauthorized materials found therein," she announced, consulting a piece of paper that looked suspiciously like it had been hastily written in ballpoint pen. That's when I made what turned out to be the smartest decision of the entire ordeal. Instead of arguing with them or trying to reason with people who were clearly beyond the reach of logic, I opened Facebook Live on my phone and started streaming the entire encounter. "Good morning, everyone," I said to the camera, keeping my voice calm and conversational. "I'm Mark Davies, and I'm currently being harassed by fake police officers hired by my HOA president to steal my office space. Let's watch this unfold together, shall we?" The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within minutes, I had over 300 viewers, then 500, then close to 1,000 people watching Blake and Christine try to intimidate their way into my office while simultaneously trying to figure out why I was filming them. The comments section exploded with people sharing similar HOA horror stories, legal advice, and increasingly creative insults directed at Blake's fake uniform. Someone with the username Lawyer Mum 2023 posted that she was recording the stream and had already contacted local news stations. Another viewer claimed to be a real police officer and was providing running commentary on all the ways Blake's equipment violated actual law enforcement protocols. Blake, apparently realizing that his performance was being broadcast to an audience that wasn't buying what he was selling, decided to escalate the situation by reaching into his utility belt and pulling out what looked like a handgun. The live stream chat went insane, with viewers screaming variations of "Call 911" and "Fake gun" in all caps. Christine looked like she was about to faint, staring at Blake with the kind of horror that suggested this wasn't part of the plan they'd discussed. "Sir," Blake announced, his voice cracking slightly with either nervousness or excitement, "you need to exit these premises immediately, or I will be forced to use necessary force to ensure compliance." That's when Ilara's voice came from behind the camera, calm and steady, as if she was commenting on the weather. "Mark, zoom in on his gun, please." I adjusted the phone angle to focus on Blake's weapon, and within seconds, the live stream chat erupted with laughter and disbelief. Even through the phone camera, it was obvious that Blake was holding a plastic toy gun, complete with an orange safety tip that he'd apparently tried to color over with a black marker. More damning, there was still a price sticker attached to the side that clearly read $12.99 in Walmart's distinctive font. The viewers went absolutely wild. Someone posted a link to the exact toy gun on Walmart's website. Another viewer had apparently called the store and confirmed they'd sold several of these toys in the past week. A user calling themselves CopWife45 posted that her husband was a real police officer and was laughing so hard at Blake's tactical gear that he'd nearly choked on his coffee. The tide of public opinion had turned so decisively against Blake and Christine that even they seemed to realize their intimidation tactic had backfired spectacularly. Blake, now visibly sweating and occasionally glancing at the camera like it might bite him, holstered his toy gun and took a step back from the door. Christine had given up all pretense of being an authority figure and was now standing behind Blake like she was trying to hide from the 1,000+ people watching their performance collapse in real time. "This isn't over, bae," Blake managed to say, but his heart wasn't in it anymore. Mrs. Vance will be in contact about next steps. Just as Blake and Christine were retreating toward their car, a sleek BMW pulled into the parking area, and Eleanor Vance herself stepped out, clearly dressed for what she expected to be a triumphant conclusion to her intimidation campaign. She was wearing what looked like an expensive business suit and carrying herself with the kind of confidence that suggested she had no idea her entire operation had just been exposed to over 200 people on social media. In her right hand, she carried what wasn't a toy gun. "Gentlemen," Eleanor called out, her voice carrying across the parking lot, with the authority of someone accustomed to having her orders followed without question, "I see we've reached the point where more serious measures are required." She raised the gun so it was visible to both me and the camera. "If you don't exit this office immediately, I'll be calling the real police to report that you've been threatening me with weapons. Let's see how your little live stream handles a SWAT team response." The chat exploded again, but this time the tone was different. People were posting 911 information, asking for our location, and warning that Eleanor had just made a threat on camera in front of over 1,000 witnesses. I realized that what had started as a way to document harassment had turned into something much more serious, and I found myself hoping that Alara's mysterious confidence in handling this situation was based on more than just optimism. Eleanor wasted no time making good on her threat. While I stood there holding my phone with over 300 people watching our confrontation unfold in real time, she pulled out her device and dialed 911 with the kind of theatrical precision that suggested she'd rehearsed this moment. "Yes, I need police assistance immediately," she said, in a voice loud enough for my live stream to pick up every word. "I'm being threatened by an armed individual who has barricaded himself in a building and is refusing to comply with lawful orders. The suspect appears to be live streaming the incident and may be planning something violent." She gave our address with perfect clarity, then added the kind of details designed to ensure a maximum police response. Multiple weapons, visible erratic behavior, possible domestic terrorism situation. The live stream chat went insane. Viewers were posting everything from legal advice to offers to call lawyers, while others were frantically trying to contact local news stations and civil rights organizations. Someone had already called the real police to report that Eleanor was filing a false report, but I knew from watching enough cop shows that police departments tend to take armed barricade calls seriously regardless of conflicting information. Within minutes, I could hear sirens approaching from multiple directions, and the knot in my stomach told me that Eleanor's escalation had just turned our HOA dispute into something that could end very badly for me. That's when Alara stepped out of the office behind me, and I saw a side of my wife that I had never witnessed before. Gone was the quiet cybersecurity consultant who deflected questions about her work with gentle smiles and subject changes. The woman standing beside me moved with the kind of controlled precision that spoke of training far beyond anything you'd learn in corporate America, and her eyes had taken on the focused intensity of someone assessing a tactical situation rather than a domestic dispute. "Mark," she said quietly, never taking her eyes off Eleanor, "I need you to keep filming, but step behind me now." Before I could ask why, Alara pulled out her phone and made a call that changed everything about our situation. But she wasn't calling 911 or a lawyer or anyone else I might have expected. Instead, she spoke in crisp, clear English with an accent I'd never heard her use before, and an authority that made every word sound like a military order. "This is Major Elara Cohen, service number 7749, Delta 9. I need immediate contact with the Israeli Consul General in Houston. Priority classification, Alpha Authorization Code 77. There was a pause, then her voice took on an even sharper edge. "Yes," I said, "Major Cohen. Pull my file if you need verification, but do it quickly. I have a situation developing that requires immediate diplomatic intervention." I almost dropped my phone. In 3 years of marriage, my wife had never mentioned military service, Israeli citizenship, or anything that would explain how she knew authorization codes for what sounded like intelligence services. The woman I'd been living with, sharing meals with, planning a future with, had been someone entirely different than I'd ever imagined. The live stream viewers were equally stunned, with comments ranging from plot twist to detailed speculation about Israeli military units and intelligence operations. Elara continued her phone conversation in rapid Hebrew, but even without understanding the language, I could tell she was giving someone a detailed tactical briefing about our situation. She rattled off information about Eleanor's real estate fraud operation, Blake's fake police credentials, and what sounded like financial details that she couldn't possibly have known, unless she'd been conducting surveillance far more sophisticated than the simple background checks she'd mentioned. When she switched back to English, it was to provide GPS coordinates, vehicle descriptions, and a precise count of how many people were involved in the confrontation. While Elara was speaking to what I could only assume were Israeli intelligence services, the first Houston Police Department cruiser arrived on the scene, followed quickly by 2 more. I watched through my phone camera as real police officers, wearing actual uniforms and carrying legitimate equipment, approached the area with the kind of cautious professionalism that made Blake's earlier performance look like a middle school play. The lead officer, a tall woman with sergeant stripes, approached Eleanor first, probably because she was the one who had made the emergency call. But something unexpected happened during that conversation. Instead of immediately moving to arrest me or demand that I exit the building, the sergeant spent several minutes talking to Eleanor, taking notes and asking questions that seemed to make Eleanor increasingly uncomfortable. I could see Eleanor gesturing toward me, and the office clearly trying to maintain her narrative about being threatened by an armed, dangerous individual, but the sergeant kept asking for documentation, identification, and proof of Eleanor's authority to make the demands she'd been making. That's when my world tilted completely off its axis. A black SUV with tinted windows pulled into the parking area, and 3 people in dark suits stepped out with the kind of coordinated movement that screamed federal law enforcement. They approached the Houston police sergeant with credentials that I couldn't see, but that carried significant weight because the sergeant's entire demeanor changed from skeptical but professional to respectfully deferential. Elara ended her phone call and looked at me with an expression that mixed regret, determination, and something that might have been love. "Mark," she said softly, "I need to tell you something that I should have shared a long time ago. My real name is Elara Cohen, and until 2 years ago, I was a major in the Israel Defense Forces specializing in counterterrorism operations in Gaza and the West Bank." She paused, and for the first time since this whole ordeal began, I saw vulnerability in her eyes. I left the service after losing my partner Sarah in an operation that went wrong, and I came to America to build a different kind of life, a normal life with you. The live stream had gone completely silent, except for the occasional comment asking if this was real or some kind of elaborate performance art. Eleanor, meanwhile, was having what appeared to be an increasingly heated conversation with the federal agents, who seemed less interested in her complaints about armed threats and more interested in asking her detailed questions about her real estate transactions and HOA enforcement procedures. Blake and Christine had retreated to their car and looked like they were seriously considering making a run for it. I never wanted you to know about my past because I was afraid it would change how you saw me. Elara continued, her voice barely audible above the sound of police radios and approaching traffic. But when Eleanor started targeting us, I realized she'd picked the wrong family to threaten, and now I'm afraid she's about to learn exactly what happens when you try to steal from someone who spent 8 years hunting down people who thought they were above the law. As if summoned by her words, one of the federal agents approached us with the kind of purposeful stride that suggested our situation had just moved far beyond anything the Houston Police Department was equipped to handle. The federal agent who approached us looked like he'd stepped out of a recruitment poster for agencies that don't officially exist, tall, clean-shaven, with the kind of alert eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of our situation in the time it took him to cross the parking lot. When he reached us, he didn't bother with introductions or small talk. Instead, he simply showed Elara a badge that I couldn't quite read from my angle, though I caught what looked like an eagle and some Hebrew text. "Major Cohen," he said in accented English, "we've been monitoring the situation for the past 6 months. We need to talk." Elara nodded, like she'd been expecting this moment, then looked at me with an expression that mixed apology and determination. "Mark, these are colleagues from my previous life. They're here because Eleanor's operation is bigger than either of us realized." She gestured toward the agent. "This is Agent David Klein from the Israeli Embassy's Security Division. They've been tracking Eleanor's money laundering operation because it has connections to organizations that pose threats to Israeli interests." The live stream chat exploded with comments ranging from, "Is this real life?" to detailed speculation about international intelligence operations. Over 1,500 people were now watching what had started as a simple HOA dispute transform into something that belonged in a spy thriller. Agent Klein glanced at my phone, then at Elara. "Should we be concerned about operational security?" he asked. Elara shook her head. "At this point, transparency is our best protection. Let them watch." Agent Klein opened a tablet and showed us what appeared to be a comprehensive surveillance file on Eleanor Vance that went back years: financial records, phone intercepts, travel patterns, and business connections that painted a picture far more complex than simple real estate fraud. Mrs. Vance has been laundering money for a network that funnels cash to groups operating in Syria and Lebanon. He explained, his voice carrying the matter-of-fact tone of someone briefing a military operation. Her HOA scam generates clean American real estate transactions that can be used to move significant amounts of money without triggering banking regulations. The scope of Eleanor's operation was staggering. According to the files Agent Klein showed us, she wasn't just stealing properties from individual homeowners. She was part of a sophisticated network that had moved over $2.3 million through fraudulent real estate transactions over the past 3 years. The money originated from shell companies in Cyprus and the Cayman Islands, passed through Eleanor's HOA enforcement scam, and ended up funding activities that the Israeli government considered direct threats to national security. "We've been building a case against the entire network," Agent Klein continued, "but we needed Eleanor to make a move significant enough to justify intervention. When Major Cohen reported that Eleanor was escalating to weapons-based intimidation, we decided it was time to close the operation down." He looked at Blake and Christine, who were still sitting in their car, looking increasingly desperate. "Your fake police officers there have been under surveillance since Eleanor hired them." We have recordings of their training sessions, payment records, and enough evidence to prosecute them for impersonating law enforcement officers. Eleanor, meanwhile, was having what appeared to be a complete meltdown in her conversation with the Houston police sergeant. Even from across the parking lot, I could see her gesturing wildly and raising her voice, probably demanding to know why the police weren't arresting me for the threats she'd reported. The sergeant, however, seemed more interested in asking Eleanor to provide documentation for her HOA authority and explain the discrepancies between her claims and the evidence that was rapidly mounting against her. That's when Blake made what turned out to be the worst decision of his entire amateur acting career. Realizing that the situation was spiraling beyond anything he'd signed up for, he started his Honda Civic and attempted to drive away from the scene. Unfortunately for Blake, his escape route took him directly past one of the Houston police cruisers, where a quick-thinking officer had positioned his vehicle to block the parking lot exit. Blake's desperate attempt to flee ended with him driving directly into the side of a police car, then sitting in his smoking Honda, while officers surrounded his vehicle with the kind of professional efficiency that made his earlier police impersonation look even more ridiculous. Christine, seeing Blake's arrest unfold, apparently decided that cooperation was her best option for avoiding a similar fate. She exited the Honda with her hands already raised, calling out, "I want to make a deal. I have information about Eleanor's operation." The Houston police officers cuffed her with practiced efficiency while she continued shouting details about payment schedules, training sessions, and what sounded like enough evidence to prosecute Eleanor for conspiracy, fraud, and probably half a dozen federal crimes. But Eleanor wasn't done fighting. As she watched Blake and Christine being processed by the police, and as Agent Klein's team began documenting the scene with the kind of thoroughness that suggested this was far from their first international money laundering operation, Eleanor made a decision that transformed our confrontation from a law enforcement matter into something much more dangerous. She pulled out the handgun she'd been carrying and pointed it directly at me, her hands shaking with what looked like a combination of desperation and rage. "This is insane," she screamed loud enough for my live stream audience and every law enforcement officer in the area to hear clearly. "I'm not going to prison because some computer nerd couldn't follow simple HOA rules." The chat went silent for a moment, then exploded with all caps warnings and people claiming they were calling additional police departments. Alara stepped between Eleanor and me with the kind of fluid movement that spoke of countless hours of training for exactly this type of situation. "Mrs. Vance," she said, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had faced down armed opponents many times before. "I've personally neutralized 12 armed terrorists using nothing but hand-to-hand combat techniques. Do you think a handgun is going to intimidate me?" For 3 seconds, that felt like 3 hours, Eleanor held the gun pointed at Alara, while 1,500 live stream viewers held their collective breath. Then Alara moved with a speed and precision that made Eleanor's weapon look like a toy in the hands of a child. One moment, Eleanor was holding a gun. The next moment, she was on the ground, with her arm twisted behind her back, the weapon skittering across the asphalt, and Alara kneeling beside her with the kind of controlled force that immobilized without causing permanent damage. Eleanor began crying like a child who'd just realized that the game she'd been playing had consequences she'd never considered. Eleanor's tears were still flowing when Agent Klein's partner approached with a tablet displaying what appeared to be intercepted communications that painted an even darker picture of our HOA president's criminal enterprise. "Mrs. Vance," the agent said, showing her the screen, "we have recordings of your conversations with Hassan Mahmoud in Beirut, financial transfers to accounts linked to Hezbollah-front organizations, and enough evidence to charge you under the Patriot Act for material support of terrorism. Eleanor's crying intensified as she realized that her real estate scam had connected her to people and organizations far more dangerous than she'd ever imagined. But even as Eleanor was being read her rights by Houston police officers, Agent Klein was coordinating with his team to address what he called remaining operational concerns, while I continued live streaming to an audience that had grown to over 2,000 fascinated viewers. Federal agents were tracking down the other fake security officers Eleanor had deployed throughout the community. According to the surveillance reports Agent Klein shared with us, Eleanor had hired 4 additional contractors who were currently attempting to intimidate 3 other property owners using the same tactics Blake and Christine had employed against us. The coordination between Israeli intelligence and American law enforcement was impressive to watch. Within 30 minutes of Eleanor's arrest, federal agents had located and apprehended 2 men who'd been impersonating security officers at a house 6 blocks away, where they'd been demanding entry to inspect a property whose owner had refused to pay Eleanor's fabricated fines. A third fake officer was arrested at a coffee shop where he'd been meeting with Christine Miller to receive instructions for his next assignment. The fourth and final member of Eleanor's enforcement team was picked up at his apartment, where agents found a collection of fake badges, printed citations, and what appeared to be a handbook titled Community Security Procedures that Eleanor had written herself. Christine, meanwhile, was proving to be a treasure trove of information about Eleanor's operation. Under questioning by federal agents, she revealed that Eleanor's real estate fraud was just one component of a larger money laundering network that included fake charity organizations, shell construction companies, and what Christine described as meetings with scary foreign men who paid in cash and didn't speak much English. The scope of Eleanor's criminal enterprise kept expanding with each new piece of evidence the agents uncovered. The most shocking revelation came when Agent Klein showed us financial records, indicating that Eleanor had been moving money for her overseas contacts for over 5 years, long before she'd started the HOA property seizure scam. The real estate fraud had been a later addition to her money laundering operation, a way to generate additional clean American assets that could be sold to create untraceable cash for international transfers. My little office rental had been targeted, not because Eleanor particularly cared about HOA rules, but because the property represented approximately $50,000 in value that could be seized, sold, and converted into funding for activities that posed direct threats to Israeli national security. But Agent Klein had saved the best surprise for last. While Eleanor was being processed by Houston police and Christine was confessing to enough federal crimes to ensure she'd be spending the next decade in prison, Elara had been conducting her own parallel investigation, using resources that went far beyond anything available to civilian cybersecurity consultants. "Mark," she said, pulling out her phone and showing me a tracking application I'd never seen before. "Remember when I said I'd been researching Eleanor's operation? I may have planted a small GPS tracking device in Christine's purse last week when she came to inspect our property." The tracking device had led federal agents directly to a storage unit on the outskirts of Houston, where Eleanor had been keeping financial records correspondence with her overseas contacts and what appeared to be detailed plans for expanding her money laundering operation to other HOA communities throughout Texas. More importantly, the storage unit contained evidence linking Eleanor to a network of similar operations in Florida, Arizona, and Nevada, suggesting that her HOA scam was part of a much larger national conspiracy to use American real estate markets for international money laundering. The final arrests came almost anticlimactically. Federal agents used the evidence from Eleanor's storage unit to identify and arrest her primary contact in the United States, a man named David Petroff, who'd been coordinating money transfers between Eleanor's real estate sales and overseas accounts. Petroff was picked up at Houston Intercontinental Airport, apparently attempting to board a flight to Cyprus with $200,000 in cash and what investigators later determined were forged diplomatic documents. 6 months later, the legal aftermath had sorted itself out in ways that felt like justice served with a side of poetic irony. Eleanor received 12 years in federal prison for money laundering conspiracy to support terrorism and operating a criminal enterprise. Christine got 8 years for her role as the operational coordinator of the fake security scheme. Blake and the other fake officers received sentences ranging from 2 to 4 years for impersonating law enforcement officers and participating in a conspiracy to commit fraud. Most satisfyingly, the 15 families whose properties had been stolen through Eleanor's HOA scam had their homes and rights restored, with the federal government seizing Eleanor's ill-gotten assets to provide restitution. The new Maplewood Heights HOA, elected in a special community meeting that drew unprecedented attendance, unanimously voted to implement new transparency requirements, public oversight of all enforcement actions, and a strict prohibition on any fees or fines not explicitly outlined in publicly available documents. They also voted to elect me as the new HOA president, apparently from the theory that someone who'd survived Eleanor's intimidation campaign might be qualified to prevent similar abuses in the future. Elara and I kept the office space, which we converted into Davies Security Consulting, with Elara officially joining the business as senior tactical advisor. Our first client was the new HOA, which hired us to conduct security assessments and ensure that their new transparency measures were being properly implemented. When people ask what my wife does for work, I just smile and say she solves problems. After everything we've been through, nobody ever asks for clarification. The best part, last month I received a letter from Eleanor's prison address. She'd written a 47-page proposal titled Comprehensive Guidelines for Proper Community Management and Conflict Resolution, which she wanted the new HOA to consider implementing. I had the first page framed and hung it in our office right next to a photo from our live stream showing Blake's toy gun and Eleanor's final arrest. Even from federal prison, she still can't stop trying to make rules for other people. Sometimes the people we live with every day carry secrets that could change everything we thought we knew about them. However, love isn't about knowing every detail of someone's past. It's about trusting them when it matters most. Have you ever discovered something unexpected about someone close to you? Share your story below. And if this reminded you that justice finds a way, give us a like and subscribe to HOA Stories for more stories where the underdog wins.